I'm Annie Kern with the Marion County Prosecutor's Office. Welcome. There are some new faces here. We just want to make sure we acknowledge those people that are here from the different organizations. I think we've got Cafe here. Is there anyone else here that's new tonight for the first time? What organization? Are you with an organization?
Marion County Clerk's Office.
Marion County Clerk's Office. Welcome.
Nurse Family Partnership.
Nurse Family Partnership. Anyone else? Okay, I know there are several organizations that are here, whether it's the Multi-Service Center, whether you're representing a church or a school. Tonight's session, I encourage you to take notes and take some of those notes, and if you have a newsletter, social media system working in your organization, share the information. You've heard the phrase, when you learn, teach. So let's practice that. Tonight and also every other night, and then our last Monday night. Well, we're going to get started. I'm going to have the person that's going to introduce our speakers come forward, and that is Deborah Law. She is the Deputy Prosecuting Attorney in the Community Prosecution Division. Thanks, Deborah.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight. We have two fabulous speakers this evening. I think you're really going to enjoy the program. Linda Major is the Director of Domestic Violence Initiatives for the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, where she's also been a Deputy Prosecutor since 1996. Ms. Major specializes in the prosecution of crimes of domestic violence and also works with law enforcement agencies and community agencies to develop strategies and implement initiatives designed to reduce domestic-related homicides here in Marion County. Christina Koroboff is the Director of Prosecutor Education at the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, as well as the Supervisor of the Special Victims Team. Christina has been prosecuting cases involving domestic and sexual violence and child abuse since 1997. She has served as Chief of Sex Crimes and Child Abuse Unit, Chief of the Domestic Violence Unit, and also a Major Felony Prosecutor. In 2002, Christina was named Prosecutor of the Year by the Indiana Coalition Against Sexual Assault and received an Outstanding Lecturer Award from the Communities Against Rape Centers of Hope for Youth. So thank you very much for being here, and please welcome our two speakers.
Thank you, Deb. I'm so glad that you all are here tonight. And for those of us watching, we appreciate you joining us. As we kick off kind of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we see a lot of people wearing purple, and that's fantastic to raise awareness. But as Annie pointed out, it's so important to learn so that we can pass on to others. For those of us who work in domestic and family violence, when the Ray Rice case hit, it was of no surprise to us any aspects of it. The fact that there were people who are wealthy who were involved in it, not surprising. The fact that Janae Rice wanted really nothing to do with prosecution or didn't think of herself as a victim, not surprising. The fact that the different people responded different ways. Even the response of one of the Pacers, if she ain't tripping, I ain't tripping. None of that surprising to any of us in the movement. And yet, the more that people talk about domestic violence, what both Linda and I have realized is that people will approach us and will sometimes say to us something that we think, oh, that's a myth about domestic violence. It's very commonly held, but there are just certain misconceptions about domestic violence that we want to address here tonight. So as we speak, we welcome questions and interaction from the audience because we really want to have a discussion about this, hopefully to empower every one of you to go out and have meaningful discussions about domestic violence in your community, because the best friend of an abuser is silence and ignorance. And we hope to lift a lot of that tonight so that we see fewer cases ultimately in our court, and that we can treat this within the community and really help to get victims to a position of safety and abusers to a position where they are addressing their behaviors and changing it before these result in the domestic homicides that we sometimes see. So with that, we'll get started. Again, I think for the protocol for questions, if you have questions and you want to throw up your hand and you can be really loud on your own, we'll welcome them as we go along, okay?
I would like to add my thanks to Christina's for coming and listening to us this evening. This is such an important issue, and it's good to see that you all have taken time out of your schedules to come and listen to find out how we can be as involved as possible in reducing domestic-related homicide and domestic violence generally. So thank you for being here. So we're addressing some myths this evening about domestic violence. First of all, let's talk about the framework that we're going to be talking about this in this evening. What is domestic violence? Although violence on a parent against a child or vice versa, cousins, etc., is violence, we're not talking specifically about that kind of violence this evening. What we're talking about is domestic violence, also known as dating violence or intimate partner violence. And so it goes by various names, as I've just talked about. And the definition that we're going to use is that it is a pattern of assaultive behaviors that adults or adolescents use against their dating or intimate partners. And it's purposeful conduct. And the person who is doing it does it as a means of achieving compliance from or control over the person that they're doing it against. So this is more than just somebody getting angry and striking out. This is about an attempt of one person to control the actions and the thoughts and the movements of another person when we're talking about domestic violence. So the first myth that we're going to talk about, domestic violence or intimate partner violence, is a family matter. It's not a crime. One of the things that's important to recognize about domestic violence is, again, the purpose is to gain and maintain control over another individual. When we talk about domestic violence, it is a crime. One of the things that we have, particularly in our schools as well, we're trying to communicate when we do trainings in the schools, is to get people to understand that this isn't something that needs to just be behind closed doors, right? It's kind of like mold or a toxic mold. The more that you keep it in a dark area and you don't talk about it, you don't address it for the crime that it is, the more likely it is to contaminate everything that's around it, right? You would be absolutely outraged if I, as a prosecutor, witnessed something happen at a bus stop where one person who didn't know the other hauled off and knocked the living bejesus out of the other person, and they were knocked unconscious. He said, you know what, I just don't feel like prosecuting that case because, well, they didn't really know each other. It's not that big of a deal. They'll probably never see each other again. Of course not. A crime is a crime no matter who it's committed against. And really, how much more concerning is that someone who is supposed to love, protect, and take care of another person can act in a way that violates them so aggressively that they're injured as a result of that. So domestic violence is a crime. It's not something that just because it's not, the people know each other, that it's not something that we should pay attention to. And the interesting thing about domestic violence is oftentimes the more resistance that one person will give to it, whether it's the verbal abuse or the physical abuse, the increase, it results in an increase in violence. So a lot of times we say, why do people stay in these relationships? And we'll get to that in a minute. But one thing that it's important to recognize is when people oftentimes do show any kind of resistance to the control, there's an increased effort by the person who is the batterer or the abuser to get that back. And what that often looks like is more violence. Again, this issue, this myth that it's not our issue. This is a picture of Jeremiah Williams. My pastor and first lady raised him from the age of about, I want to say maybe 4 months old. One day at about 8 years old, his mother called and wanted him back. Some issues, I guess, that she was having with Child Protection Services. They had no option but to go ahead and give Jeremiah back. Jeremiah's mother was in a violent relationship with her ex-boyfriend. She didn't want to be with him anymore, and one day the boyfriend came over, made a lot of threats, allegedly said something like, "It's murder time," left the scene, came back a little bit later with a shotgun, fired the shotgun into the house, and Jeremiah was struck in the head and he was killed. The point that I want you to take away from this is that if we don't treat domestic violence and threats like that as a crime, then tragedies like this happen, and in fact they do happen every day. If everybody else says it's not really that big of an issue, it's just two people who can't work it out, which is another myth that we'll be talking about in a little bit, then tragedies like this will continue to happen. Jeremiah, when he was killed, one of the most difficult things that I as a mother had to do was explain to my 4-year-old daughter, who considered Jeremiah her best friend, why it is that Jeremiah was not going to be in her life anymore. So it is a crime, it is our business, it's everybody's business, and we need to make sure that we empower ourselves to act in ways that can stop domestic violence and domestic-related homicide.
I think one thing to think about, too, is the notion that your home should be the safest place where you can be, right? And so when people say, well, if that happens behind closed doors, it's not my problem. It's a private issue or a family matter. You think about that should be the one place, your home, where you get refuge and you get away from all the other violence. And so when home becomes a violent place, it's why it's so important that we make sure that it is safe and that we offer options for people who are in violent homes so that we can end the violence.
Absolutely. The crime, again, domestic violence. 1 in 4 U.S. women and 1 in 7 U.S. men aged 18 and older have been the victim of severe physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 1 in 4. Now, most of us know way more than 4 people. The odds of you running across someone who is a victim, if you yourself are not a victim of domestic violence, are very, very high. I do presentations and travel every now and then. And I can't tell somebody about what I do when I'm sitting down on a plane and they ask me, oh, so what do you do? Without them telling me a story about somebody that either was killed or someone who was affected deeply in their lives by domestic violence. So it is an issue and it affects many, many people. This is a staggering statistic and one that should make all of us as parents or people who have nieces and nephews very concerned. In a nationwide survey, 9.4% of high school students report being hit, slapped, or physically hurt on purpose by their boyfriend or girlfriend the 12 months prior to the survey. That number is staggering. And to think that there are children, our own children, who are experiencing domestic violence, that's a pretty high number. And I can tell you when I've done trainings in the schools, that number looks a lot higher than is actually represented there. So what do we need to do as parents? Recognizing that our children are either going to know someone or be victims themselves, we really need to make sure that we are educating them. What are the signs and symptoms of domestic violence? Not only that, what do healthy relationships look like? We talk to our kids about stay away from drugs, don't go with strangers, but the most basic thing that can really set up what might ruin the rest of their lives about healthy relationships, for some reason, we as a community don't have these conversations with our children. It is absolutely essential if we are going to have healthy children and healthy relationships that we talk to them about these issues. And of course, as I said, it is a crime. Battery, domestic battery, stalking, rape, kidnapping, invasion of privacy, violations of orders of protection. These are all crimes that are recognized by all states. And in Indiana, many of these crimes are also major felony crimes. So again, if you see something, hear something, report it. It is our business as a community.
Myth number 2 is that only women are victims of domestic violence. And sometimes we hear, well, what about the men? When it is a man who's charged with domestic violence, and we hear things like, well, Indiana is a woman's state. And all a woman has to do is say that she's been beaten, and next thing you know, the poor guy gets locked up. And I can assure you that is not accurate. We work very diligently with our police officers to train them, to investigate as much as they possibly can on scene or with follow-up to ensure that they are arresting the correct person for a crime of domestic violence. However, it's just really important to know that anyone can be a victim of domestic violence. You know, when you think about who else can be a victim of domestic violence other than women, well, men can most certainly be victims of domestic violence. I also prosecuted crimes of violence in Leesburg, Virginia. It's a suburb of D.C. And I remember one of the men I worked with there who was a victim said, you know what? The hardest thing for me when she does hit me sometimes is that she tells me if I ever try to leave her that she'll divorce me and she'll get the kids in the custody dispute. And he believed that with 100% certainty. And he said, why is it that I should lose my ability to read my kids a story at bedtime every single night just because I don't want her to hit me? So the reality is that this can happen to men as well. And with Linda pointing out the statistic of how often it happens, it's important for us to recognize that it can happen to men too. Teenagers and young adults as well is really important to recognize that they can be victims. This photo is Joanna Orozco. She was dating a young man named Juan Ruiz. He was a juvenile at the time that they were involved. I believe she was about 18 years old and he was 17. And she said that he had raped her. And so he was arrested within the juvenile system, but he was released from custody pending trial. and he went to her house with a shotgun and he blew off the lower portion of her face. And this is her after he hurt her. And so please do not write off acts of domestic violence by teenagers as just kids being kids. It is not that. And when Linda talks about going into high schools and talking about healthy relationships, one of the things that we've got to address, very important, is the notion of technology being used to stalk and how easy it is for kids to see that as love. He's texted me 500 times today. He must really love me. No, I don't have time to text anyone 500 times a day, okay? That's stalking. That's not love, especially when it elevates to a level where it interferes with an individual's ability to kind of go about their daily life, or when it's an attempt to monitor them. Where are you? What are you doing? Why haven't you called me back? Those kind of messages. So it's so important to send kids a message now that, again, like Linda said, what does a healthy relationship look like? And I can promise you it is not 500 text messages a day. It's also important to recognize that people who are in same-sex relationship or transgendered individuals can also be victims of domestic violence. And having worked with same-sex couples, both here and in Virginia, I can tell you that a lot of times the violent patterns look exactly the same. The partner who's being beaten will make excuses for or try to cover for the batterer in some way. And so it doesn't matter the sex of the parties. When you identify one as the victim and one as the perpetrator, it really, the genitalia at that point doesn't matter. Many of the behaviors, the fears, the coping mechanisms are exactly the same in some of these relationships. So whether you think that gay marriage should be legal or not, that is not the issue at all. It's that anyone in a relationship has a right to be safe in that relationship. And so it's important that we recognize, too, with couples who are in same-sex relationships, that one of the things that sometimes gets used against them is the notion of, if you tell what's going on, I'll out you. I'll call your boss. I'll let him know that you're gay. And you're a teacher at a private school. How do you think that's going to go over? So it's a nice way to keep someone quiet, right? So being in a same-sex relationship will sometimes give the batterer an extra weapon against the victim to help to keep them quiet about what it is that's going on. It's important that we remove those barriers. Also important in determining who can be a victim of domestic violence is to remember that while Linda says, for tonight's purposes, we're talking about physical violence, that we also recognize there's a lot of ways to control a person within the context of an intimate partner relationship, like financial abuse, right? If I hold the checkbook in the relationship and my name is on the lease and my name is on the power bill and I'm the one who has your cell phone bill so I can check all your incoming and outgoing calls, right? How easy do you think it is to leave that relationship, right? Next to impossible if one person holds the purse strings or if one person has a financial benefit that the other needs. Stalking, another way, where it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. We certainly see any number of female stalkers who can get behind a computer screen and really increase the fear in a male or another female victim by simply that constant communication and that constant threat. And it's important to remember, too, in intimate partner violence, we think about the person that you're the closest to in this world and all the secrets that they know about you, right? So are you more afraid of being hit, or are you afraid of them releasing private information about you? And so when you do get hit and they know that private information, how powerful is that to be able to lord that over you?
And this is especially concerning now that teenagers really don't understand what privacy is anymore. The name privacy just has a completely different context. So if they're in these relationships and we haven't taken the time to talk to them about what healthy relationships are, and you don't send selfies and all these other kind of things, then once they send those compromising pictures, they can basically have that lorded over them throughout for however long the person wants to have them. Because as you know, once those images are out there, they're out there. And if you think about what even a grown person would do, much less a teenager would do, to keep from getting those pictures to their parents or to friends or whatever the case might be, this is a very powerful tool that we really need to make sure that we're talking with our kids about.
Another form of domestic violence or intimate partner control can be verbal degradation. And quite frankly, I think this is one of the worst parts about domestic violence is it's perfectly legal to call your intimate partner awful names, to make fun of them in terrible ways, to prey upon their worst fears verbally. And you do that enough and you say that enough and they start to believe, if they didn't already, that they don't deserve any better. I'll apologize for my language, but one of the women I'd worked with in Virginia, I would listen to her perpetrator call her from jail. And in the jail calls, he called her fat bitch. And she answered to that as though it was her name. She'd been with him for a number of years, since she was a child. And it just became, this is the way that he talks to me. And so it was never surprising to me when she went back, because she didn't believe she deserved any better. And yet they were raising a child in this. So it's so important that whether she believes that she deserves it or not, that it not be tolerated. Also important to recognize that even in the context of an intimate partner relationship, that forcible or coercive sex is also used to control a person. It is not legal to force your spouse to have sex, though there is no marital rape exception in Indiana. So we certainly do see cases where intimate partners will take that right to say no away from their partner. Isolation and separation are also ways to control within the context of a domestic violence relationship. If I get you away from people that you love, it makes it a lot easier for me to hurt you without any repercussions, right? And then, of course, victimizing others to punish the primary or the adult victim. Many times we see that there are other people in the household or even a pet that's being abused. And not only is it being done to control everyone else in the household, but it's also being done as a means to punish the victim for their non-compliance. One particular case I remember out of New York where the man in the relationship, the batterer, had gotten really mad at his wife because she wouldn't burn their child with an iron. So he burned her with the iron. Just accept that this is going on in these households. That's why it's so important that we intervene. Myth number 3, wealthy, educated people do not batter their partners. So I'm here to tell you, the county I worked in Virginia, Loudoun County, was the wealthiest county per capita in the United States. I was the domestic violence prosecutor there. Believe me, I was busy. Okay? I'm here to tell you that it is alive and well among people who have education, who have status, who have wealth. And, you know, when you see certain families, you look at them and you think, this is a perfect family. What on earth could be, what a lovely Olin Mills photo opportunity. And yet Mr. Coleman killed his entire family in a suburb of St. Louis and worked really hard to cover it up. But part of what goes on in these families is they don't look dangerous. And I like to talk about the fear of people overlooking people who are nice. Right? We don't suspect people are so polite. They come into court and like, oh, yes, Your Honor. No, Your Honor. And then you listen to their jail calls. And it is a completely different persona there. But understand that one of the best things that batters have going for them is the ability to be verbally manipulative. To have others believing that I am so nice and pull up on the scene. Don't you think that a wealthy, educated individual is better able to control police officers? And to get them to accept that there's nothing going on here. It's no big deal. My wife, she's a little too much to drink and not taking her meds right now. So, and of course, the victim may be hysterical and crazy and very upset about what's going on. So, again, sometimes wealth and education are barriers to recognizing what's going on in a home. And perhaps as importantly is the fact that when you're poor and you're being battered, where do you go? You go to the system, right? You may need a shelter. You may need public assistance. So we see more domestic violence, the numbers of people seeking assistance for it, who fall into the classes of people who may not have as much wealth or access to education. But it certainly does happen to others. It's also important to remember that those financial stresses, they can affect wealthy people too. But when you look at stressors that sometimes exacerbate domestic violence, they just may have a greater impact on people who have less access to resources, right? Because when you're living paycheck to paycheck, the likelihood of an argument between a husband and wife or two partners over money and how things are going, it's a lot more likely, right, when you're stressed out about money. But what we found is that when the recession hit, and you had a lot of these wealthy, educated families who suddenly find themselves in dire straits, and maybe you've gone months without jobs. Oh, again, believe me, that's when I went out to Loudoun County to prosecute, as in when the markets were dropping there and there were all kinds of issues. And suddenly you saw a lot of these families facing real financial stress, and it really did become a source of disagreements in a home, which now I've got to take control, and you would see the violence. We talked about why violence is easier to hide when you have resources, and ultimately leaving can still be really difficult, because when you've got a lot of wealth and you've got education, you're not just going to pick up and leave a really good job, right? And you're not just going to pick up and leave a really nice home where your kids are in a really good school system. It can be just as difficult to say, I don't want to deprive my kids of everything that I've got and everything that they've got here. And so you may be more likely to tough it out or to stay until the violence ultimately reaches a level where it may be deadly.
Myth number 4, the faith-based community experiences the least amount of domestic violence. It is very important to recognize that domestic violence is as prevalent in the faith-based community as it is in the secular community. One of the reasons is because, remember that toxic mold I was telling you about, how it breeds better in certain conditions? Well, when you are in an environment, especially where when you're talking about in faith-based, a lot of times, for example, the misuse of scripture, when you talk about the concepts of headship and submission by abusers, is something that are used to keep people in those violent relationships. And when your faith is very important to you, and it's and the reasons for you staying in that relationship are sometimes misapplied by either the abuser or sometimes even the clergy or people that you're talking with, it can be very difficult to get out. Also, issues regarding divorce, lack of education in the church leadership. One of the things when I do education in the faith-based community, it is very difficult sometimes to convince clergy that when you're talking about doing counseling for people who are in domestic violence, you cannot do joint counseling. You can't do it together. Why do you suppose that is? Exactly. If you really understand that domestic violence is about power and control, one of two things is going to happen during that counseling session, right? Either the person who's being victimized is going to finally feel comfortable enough to say something about it, in which case they still have to go home with that individual, so they may have to deal with the consequences, or they're not going to say anything at all about the situation. So then you have the faith-based leader who is getting a distorted picture of what's really going on and giving them advice based on what the information that they're giving, and it's not a complete picture. And so both of them go back, the abuser being more empowered to continue what he's doing, and the victim just needs to try a little bit harder to be more consistent with the Bible says what a wife should be like. Poor counseling choices due to lack of expertise. Again, we just talked about that. And a lot of times when you talk about your faith-based communities, it's keep it quiet, keep it in prayer. I am a strong advocate of prayer, but I also understand, and it's important to let people know, that we have been given resources to be able to move as well, to move on that. It's one thing to have faith, it's another thing entirely to really use the resources that God has given us to be able to make things happen. So again, it is important to address these issues, and a congregation really needs to know, churches really need to know how to have a safety plan in effect so they can deal with this. Recognize the vulnerability of the victim and the congregation. We'll talk a little bit about the significance of how things get more dangerous when a separation occurs. But if there's one place that after a victim leaves, an offender knows they can probably find that person, if they are a person of faith, it's at their church. For example, if you were to follow me around, you'd know exactly where I'm going to be Tuesday night from 6 to 8, Wednesday night from 6 to 8:30, Thursday night, I'm in choir, I'm in all of these different things because my church is important to me. It's the same thing with a victim of domestic violence. They may be able to move from that situation, but they're going to go back to that place. And that's oftentimes a thing that puts them in a more vulnerable position, but also puts the congregation in a vulnerable position as well. Because if you've got an abuser who does not give a care of who's around when violence happens or the consequences of their actions, then that's a danger not just to the person who's being victimized, which is bad enough, but it's also a danger to the entire congregation. One of the things that I have been disappointed with over the years, but hopefully is changing, is that the faith-based community frequently backs offenders, but the support for victim in the courtroom is significantly lacking. So I have to tell you that over the course of the 18 years of prosecuting cases, one of the things that is very frustrating is I will see a clergy member come to court on behalf of an offender, has no idea even what the charges are involving, but will go ahead and vouch for that person, not knowing the dangerousness involved in that situation. But I can tell you that over the 18 years that I've been there, that I've been prosecuting cases, I have never had a situation where a clergy member comes on behalf of a victim and sits with them. Now, I know that it has happened because I've also been with the Domestic Violence Vitality Review Team, and there are members of the clergy who do an excellent job in working with survivors of domestic violence. But as a whole, this is an area that the faith-based community can definitely step up and respond to. Another thing, forgiveness does not have to be connected to reconciliation, right? Forgiveness is something that is for the individual, that allows them to be able to move on and move forward. Reconciliation is something that can happen when two people make the effort together to be able to get to a place where they can be back together. I think a lot of times within the faith-based community, the concern is that forgiveness necessarily means that you have to take that person back. And what I like to say when I'm talking with people is that reconciliation should follow repentance. If you are truly sorry for what you have done, then you will take responsibility for your action. And you will actually make efforts to change that behavior. It's not going to be, let's just sweep this under the rug or go to court and say that this didn't happen. If you're really sorry, then it's something that's going to show in your actions. I've listed some, you can't see them very well, some faith-based resources. There's a website, it's the www.nhcadsv.org. That's the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, which actually has developed some materials for the faith-based community. And there's some other websites, faithtrustinstitute.org and safeplaceministries.com. Myth number 5. Victims who go back to their abusers get what they pay for, or they like the drama. A lot of times this looks like why wouldn't they just leave? If it's that bad, why don't they just go? One of the first experiences that I had as a deputy prosecutor, which I believe really shaped a lot of who I am today, was in the first year or two that I was trying cases. I was just out of law school. And I actually started out in domestic violence court as well. And it was a misdemeanor or a D felony case, which is sort of your lower class crimes. And I was talking with this woman who, I believe that she was married. They had children in common. They had children together. And she was telling me about all of these terrible things that she was suffering as a result of the domestic violence. I mean, there were weapons involved. He would physically and sexually abuse her in front of the children. I mean, it was just all this horrible stuff that she had been living through. So as a young deputy prosecutor, I'm writing all this stuff down and thinking, okay, this is a really important stuff that the judge is going to need to know so that we can respond appropriately to this crime and get this victim some justice. So I explained to her, we're getting ready to do a bond review. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go in the courtroom. I'm going to explain to the judge that we want a no contact order so that you and your kids can be safe. I'm also going to ask for the judge to give a high bond so that it can give you some time to figure out what it is that you need to do. You can have some time to get some safety planning together. And she said, whoa, slow down. If you think I'm going into that courtroom and I'm going to tell the judge what I just told you, you're going to have to give me some of what you're smoking because I'm going to need it to get through the next beating. And I said, okay. So I went back into the courtroom and I asked her, okay, are you concerned for your safety? Oh, no, I'm not concerned for my safety. Well, were you concerned for your safety the night that all of this happened? Oh, no. I was just concerned that things might get a little out of hand. Well, what about a no contact order? How about keeping the no contact order in effect so that, no, I can't have that because we have to communicate about the children, whatever the medical issues are, the children, we need to make arrangements for them. And so by the time we got done, after the judge was looking at me like I was crazy for wasting the court's time, she got up and she walked out of that courtroom. And I remember thinking, she sold that as if her life depended on it. And for all I knew, it did. So what I realized at that moment was, even though we both wanted the same thing for her and her kids to be safe, what safety looked like to her was completely different than what it looked like to me as a law enforcement officer going home to a happy, healthy, safe environment. So even though we wanted the same thing, how we got there was different. Her main focus was on being a survivor, and that's all I can ask her to do. So if we're waiting on domestic violence victims to deal with this issue and to just leave, and that's how we're going to deal with domestic violence, we're going to be waiting forever. because their focus, as it should be, is on one thing, and that's survival. Wouldn't that be your focus in any dangerous situation? As a community, we're asking the wrong question. We shouldn't be asking, why are they staying? We should be asking, why do batterers continue to make the choice to abuse? And once we can get to that, to offender accountability, then maybe we can start making a difference in domestic violence in our community. Also, the stress of being in a violent relationship every day is absolutely taxing. It wears survivors of domestic violence down. If you think about the most stressful day you have ever had, maybe for me it was before I started this job, maybe it was, before I started the job, staying up several nights in a row trying to study for finals or exams, and maybe I had some bad conversation with my then boyfriend, now husband, whatever the case might have been. It is hard to think when you go so long without sleep and you're trying to focus on one particular thing. Well, for survivors of domestic violence, that is a daily thing. How do I act in a way that is not going to cause this person to go off on me or on my children or on me in front of my children? One of the things that I've done is I was on a committee for the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team. And what we did was, for Marion County, we looked at the domestic-related homicides, and we said, okay, how can we pick these apart and figure out how, as a community, we can respond in ways that can prevent domestic-related homicide? Well, one of the things that we learned, or that I talk about, is the difference between a victim and a survivor. So for me, a survivor is anybody who's not 6 feet under, okay? Because like I said, they do what they do to stay alive. Another thing is that when we as a community or as a criminal justice system fail to be able to give the response that changes that situation, that is to get the batterer to be held accountable, then survivors of domestic violence really start negotiating basically for their lives, really. They start to figure out, okay, how can I act in this relationship in a way that's going to allow me to be safe? And again, even though that may look very strange to people on the outside looking in, what they're thinking about is how they can continue to survive. And also, one of the other things is lethality. One of the most important things to understand is that the most dangerous time for a survivor of domestic violence is separation. We tell victims all the time, you've got to leave this relationship, it's dangerous, don't stay, once you get out, everything will be great. But what we recognize that in the overwhelming majority of those cases that result in domestic-related homicide, it occurs after the victim has attempted to leave or the abuser perceives that the victim is attempting to leave that relationship. So what survivors of domestic violence know is what we as a community are now learning, which is saying to just leave without having a plan can be sometimes exceedingly dangerous. So I would not advocate anybody not trying to leave, but what I would say is if you're going to leave, you need a plan. And it's not as simple as us on the outside saying, just walk out the door. Remember, survivors survive. A couple of other things I really wanted to hit on quickly. Sometimes people don't stay in necessarily because they're afraid, but sometimes there are some other myths that go along with that. A lot of times, especially in talking with young adults, one of the things is, well, every relationship has its ups and its downs. And so you take the good along with the bad. And a lot of times when you come from an environment where violence is not necessarily something that is a stranger to you, then if it doesn't look that bad and it's something you can deal with and you've got a relationship and somebody that you're going through life with, then maybe it's not that bad of a thing. As long as there are ups like financial, emotional, he's quote unquote a good father, then the downs maybe sometimes are worth it. Not true. Also, especially with younger people, I've already invested so much time. If I just hang in there a little while longer, he or she is going to change. But what happens is that these relationships don't really change. They just get longer and longer over time. Also, an abusive husband or an abusive wife can be a good father. If that child, and Christina is going to talk more about this, is actually witnessing that violent, the impact on that child is profound. And we'll talk about that in a moment. I can change him or change her. The only person that can change someone is the person, him or herself. And there has to be a desire to do that within. And if that person really wants to change, you're going to see some evidence of that, as we talked about before. It'll be more than just that person saying, I'm sorry. Well, just because he did it to his other girlfriend or she did it to her other boyfriend doesn't mean that he or she is going to do it to me. If I had $1 for every time I heard someone or I had somebody in court sitting with their new girlfriend because they were in court on some allegations of what they've done to their old girlfriend, I probably could retire by now. So history is a pretty good indicator. And then perhaps the most concerning one, and Christina's already touched on this, I can't do any better. So the known is better than the unknown, and sometimes people stay in relationships believing that they can't do any better. And I think that's
Just
number
one thing I want
6.
to say before we take a quick break is that when people say, well, do they stay because they like the drama, I'd ask how many of you have ever had a bad boss? Have you ever? I have a great boss personally, so shameless plug for Terry Curry.
Now we do.
But, okay, so if you have a bad boss, how many of you just like quit that job right away? Just like, yeah, I'm out of here. My boss is awful. I'm gone. No. When I ask why you stay in that job, well, I stayed because I need the benefits. I stayed because I need the paycheck. I like my coworkers. I love my job. I just wish my boss wasn't such an awful human being. Okay, right? So doesn't that sound like some of the reasons why victims stay in violent relationships? But if you stay in that job, do I just say, it is your fault, you just must love that on-the-work drama, right? No, absolutely not. There's good reasons why it is in your own mind that you stay in that relationship or in that workplace relationship. And ultimately, when you choose to leave, it's usually because you had a good out, right? But we can't say, look, well, you stayed, it must not have been that bad. The truth is, it can be absolutely awful. But when you're dependent on that job or you love that job, you just wish the abusive behavior would change, it's exactly the same thing that domestic violence victims go through. Only when you have a bad job, you go to a safe home at the end of the day, right? Imagine that your bad boss is in your home and controls everything. So with that, we will take a quick break.
And ladies?
Okay. Thank you for coming back. I know you didn't really have many places you could go, but I feel like I should say that. So I always have to lower the microphone after Linda speaks. All right, so let's talk about children and the impact of domestic violence on children. So I am primarily sex crimes, child abuse prosecutor, and I also supervise our domestic violence units. But I see a lot of the ways that domestic violence ultimately impacts children who live in this. And I hate the phrase children who witness domestic violence because, I'm sorry, when someone is beating on your mother or someone else that you love in the home, I don't really think you're a witness anymore. I think that has a strong impact on you and makes you a secondary victim, even if you're not yourself being physically hit by the blows. Quite frankly, I think I'd rather take a blow than to see someone hurt my mother. And so you can imagine what this is like for children in these homes. And I think the first time that I ever really appreciated how domestic violence can impact a child living in these homes is I was working with a young lady who had accused her stepfather of molesting her. And she had a delayed disclosure. I mean, this had been going on for quite some time. And when I sat down with her and I was getting ready for trial and we were talking about why it is that, she had kept this in for so long, and she said, he beats my mother. And I thought that if I told, that it would only get worse for her and that he might do that to me too. And so it was better that I just stay quiet about it and not cause any problems in the home. And so she was essentially, this man was molesting her because it was easier than speaking up and risking a beating to her mother or of having those same things happen to her and her brother who also lived in the household. So recognizing how profoundly it impacts children is really significant. And a lot of times you will hear victims of domestic violence say, I know he hurts me, but my kids don't know anything about it. I'm like, okay, well, how long can you keep the Christmas gifts hidden from your children? Right? So if they can find the hidey hole for the Christmas gifts, they know when your partner is beating you. Right? They know when your partner calls you names and threatens you and coerces you into doing things. They are well aware of what's going on in the home. Just some statistics, about 3.3 million children witness domestic violence in their homes every year. They may indirectly receive injuries as well. So sometimes a child somehow will try to intervene in the violence to protect a parent, and they wind up being injured. There are also times, though, when the violence is directed at them for any number of reasons. And it has significant impact, even on children who cannot speak. They can experience developmental delays as a result of being raised in a home where there is domestic violence. And then you look at the effects on adolescents, so all the way from infants up to teenagers who start to learn that this is normal, right? So if this becomes your belief system that this is normal, then we shouldn't be surprised when these kids cope with substance abuse, right? Because what a better way to check out from what's going on in your home than with drugs or running away, or you seek safe haven in a gang, because get this, a gang, it might be safer than your own home. That is a terrifying prospect, but you think of reasons why kids might reach out and get involved in some of that stuff, certainly, and then they experience difficulties in their own relationships as well. Within the domestic violence movement, we love wheels, the power and control wheel, and all these things that you'll see. And when you break down the wheel of secondhand abuse as it affects children, you think about things like battered children might harm themselves. They don't learn boundaries because there's always someone breaching boundaries in their home. They may have depression or flashbacks. You've got very young children who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder at times from being raised in this. And you even hear phrases now like kind of a chronic trauma reaction to just essentially being bathed in this all the time and really unable to get out from it. And the ways that kids respond are not good. Battering severely can adversely affect even infants and toddlers, things that older children see or hear, and that constant anxiety that's created from living in a home where you are afraid for the safety of someone else. It's just very intense. When you look, though, at what works for these children, what helps them to become resilient and not to fall into that same cycle, quite frankly, it's the presence of someone like you. Someone who has an investment in their life, who is a safe person, who doesn't seek to abuse or manipulate the fact that this child is clearly in a vulnerable position. Because you can imagine, if you're a Jerry Sandusky in these world, doesn't one of these kids look like a great victim? So they become a lot more vulnerable to outside kind of predators or people who might hurt them, who aren't any good in their life. So it's so important to surround these kids with positive support. These may be kids who suddenly start volunteering for, outside activities. They want to stay later at school. They have this awful reaction to, being sent home early because home is not good. So those are the kids that we really need to surround with positive support to keep them safe. Myth number 7 is that domestic violence happens when two people just can't work out their problems. The phrase that I hear is, isn't this just a toxic relationship? Right? And it's important to remember that domestic violence is not a Jerry Springer episode, okay? It might look like it at times, but when Linda talked about some of the coping mechanisms that a victim might engage in, it's important to recognize them for what they are, which is an attempt to deal with what's going on, an attempt to get to safety. And what I found with this is this notion that, well, if you just separated these two people, everything would be great. No, like Linda said, I'm sorry, but for a lot of these couples, the ink hasn't even dried on relationship number 1. In fact, there's still an open domestic violence case, and there is a new girlfriend in court. Prison dating services are alive and well. When we listen to jail calls, it's promises to that active victim, and there's 2 or 3 other girls that you're communicating with. As well. And of course, the victim has no idea that any of this is going on. But guess what? It's just grooming and prep for those 2 new victims. And if they think that this will be any different for them, that, it's just those 2 who can't get along, but I can change him, like Linda said. If he just had someone better in his life, or if she just had someone better, things would be fine. And it simply couldn't be further from the truth. A woman that I worked with in Virginia, I'll call her Susan, she perpetually blamed herself for the violence in the relationship, and she really felt like if he just knew how much I loved him, then it would change everything. And it wasn't until I sat her down and I showed her the protective order petitions from 2 prior girlfriends who'd claimed that he had done exactly the same thing to them that she said he did to her, that she really recognized, whoa, maybe this isn't me. Maybe I'm not the crazy one in this relationship. Maybe there's a problem that has nothing to do with how I respond when he's violent towards me. And it's really important to note, too, that in that relationship, it was showing her that got her to a place where she decided, I've got to do more to get out and to work to get out of this. But the violence in that relationship had gotten so bad that at one point she had kind of physically come at him to protect herself, and you better believe he called the police on her. Of course, I'm more than happy to cooperate with prosecution, right? Yeah, so it's important to remember that sometimes the escalation of violence ultimately results in the true victim now having the police called on them by the batterer. So sometimes this thought that if I just don't show up to court and I just don't testify and I just stay quiet about it, yeah, well, what's going to happen when he calls the police on you? And it can be a real problem. So this is not about a toxic relationship. It is about power and control. And living in that violence can make you feel crazy. And it may make it seem like that a lot of your coping mechanisms are crazy, but that is not what this is about. And it's important to keep focused on how it is that will get the victim to a position of safety.
All right, myth number 8. Drugs, alcohol, and stress are the leading causes of domestic violence. One of the things that I've learned over the last 18 years in working with survivors of domestic violence is that they are often ready to blame some kind of external cause, like, well, he's a great guy when he's not drinking, or he's fantastic when he's not on the drugs, as if these things themselves are actually causing the abusive behavior. They are often present in domestic violence cases, but it's important to recognize this. If you remember nothing else from this presentation from these two fabulous ladies who are standing up here this evening, it is that domestic violence is a choice. A person makes a decision as to whether or not to pick up a gun, draw back a fist, and blast somebody. It is a decision to put substances in the body that alter your ability to be able to think clearly or lower your inhibitions. So even if you say, oh, it's the drugs or it's the alcohol that are causing these things, it's still a choice to put those things in your body when you know that your inhibitions are going to be lowered enough that will allow you to do something like that. Also, when and how somebody drinks or takes drugs is controlled at other times. Violence is typically not unloaded on a boss or on a pastor or on others. It is a very controlled effort. It is a very controlled, targeted violence when you're talking about domestic violence on another person. And as controlling as batterers are, the one thing that abusers refuse to do on their own is to own responsibility for the abuse. It's always somebody else's fault. It's always these external circumstances. If you had just had dinner ready at 5 o'clock instead of at 5:30 like I told you that I wanted to, or if you had just not been able to keep the kids quiet when I came home, it's always somebody else's fault. The drugs, the alcohol. It is never the responsibility of the abuser, which is why we have to make sure that we don't become another tool in the batterer's toolkit and enabling them by putting that blame somewhere else other than the person who's actually making the choice to commit the violence. Now, drugs and alcohol, things like that, can actually be stressors, as Christina was talking about. The economy, circumstances, unemployment, these things are all things that can exacerbate an already existing situation, but they don't cause. I mean, if you think about, at least in my own situation, there is nothing that my child could do, unless I were a child abuser, then it would be different. But there's nothing that my child could do that would cause me to pull out a gun and put it to my child's head and to threaten them. It just wouldn't happen. There's no circumstance in my life that would happen that would cause me to do that. Yet we make excuses for abusers all the time. Well, she must have pushed his buttons. She must have done something to cause him to react that way. Abusers need to own, whether male or female, need to own their actions. Myth number 9, domestic violence offenders just snap when they batter or when they kill their partners. A lot of times we see this, and you see the interviews all the time of the neighbor, oh, Johnny was just so nice, I never could have seen this coming. It was just completely out of the blue. She must have done something, maybe had an affair or something crazy must have happened to make him do that. But what we find on domestic violence cases is a few things. First of all, there's a process involved. It's not just something where one day somebody picks up a gun and shoots or strangles a loved one to death. First, as Christina was talking about earlier, is that there is some sort of isolation that happens. And early in the relationship, maybe it looks like, oh, isn't this nice? This person wants to spend all of their time with me. But slowly but surely it turns into, well, why do you want to go to the movies with your sister? I mean, you've been with your sister your entire life. Don't I mean anything to you? And if I do, then you'll just stay here at home with me and prove to me that I mean more to you than your sister does. And it's little things like that that happen along the way. And it's slowly but surely changing the behavior of the person who's being controlled. And it's not something that happens all at once. It's these little things that happen bit by bit by bit. And then next thing you know, several years down the line, somebody wakes up and they say, how in the world did I get here? Well, this isolation is a big part of that. Because if you can get somebody isolated from their family, from their friends, and from their loved ones, the reality they live in is the one that you have created for them. So isolation is huge. And with that, the erosion of confidence and self-esteem. So a lot of times with the verbal and emotional attacks, like the example that Christina gave, and when you couple that with blame shifting, I verbally attack you or maybe I physically abuse you. Well, I'm really sorry about that, but if you had just done this, then that wouldn't have had to happen. And so then you think, if I just love this person more, or if I just do what they say, then it won't have to happen again. And he can be the person that I know he can be, the one that I really want to be with. And so through all of this, the abuser can subtly shift the thoughts and actions of the victim toward pleasing him or her to gain the praise and avoid the abuse. And then finally, you've got the verbal abuse that often leads to physical abuse. And any attempts that are met, or any attempts that the victim will make to try to leave that relationship, are oftentimes met with increased violence to get that imbalance of power back. So a lot of times what you see is what's referred to as the cycle. So you have this sort of tension building phase. And the way survivors of domestic violence describe this is there's nothing that they can do right. It feels like they're constantly walking around on these eggshells. If you say thank you to the cashier for giving you change, all of a sudden there's this huge argument that may turn physical because you're having an affair with the cashier. You can't wave thank you to the person in traffic without having an affair with some kind of grand conspiracy of events had you on the interstate right in front of this person. I mean, it sounds odd, but it happens all the times in these relationships. And so it's leading up to what is an explosive incident. And that could be a verbal attack, it could be a physical attack. And then after that is this calm normalcy. This is the phase that the survivors of domestic violence anxiously await, because that person is the person that they have always wanted them to be. The kind, loving, I'm sorry, sometimes it's flowers. Interestingly enough, what we see over a period of time is that calm or normalcy stage gets shorter and shorter and sometimes completely disappears. Because when you've been effective in shifting blame all of that time, you don't even need to try to do it anymore. It's just something that occurs naturally in that relationship. The person begins to internalize, what did I do wrong and how can I fix this? So also what we've noticed, and this is one of the things that I also learned on the Domestic Violence Vitality Review team, there are certain dangerousness factors that tend to be associated with domestic-related homicides. So one of the first one is suicidal or homicidal threats, attempts, or ideation. So this is more than just somebody saying, I'm going to kill you, which is enough of a red flag. But this is someone actually saying, I'm going to kill you, then I'm going to cut you up and cook you and feed you to your favorite dog. Now, the reason that that's concerning is because this person has actually taken the time to think about it. And not only think about it, but express that thought to you. So if you think about the impact that that can have on an individual, knowing this person that I love just said this to me, and I believe that this person is capable of doing it, this is something that we tend to see on a lot of these cases that result in domestic-related homicides. An escalation in the frequency and the severity of the violent episodes. I had a case once with a woman who said that early on in the relationship it was just verbal abuse, but over the course of several years it got to a point where she was being abused really pretty much once every 9 weeks. She could see it coming. That's how frequent it was. Violations of court orders in the past. Now, why do you think a violation of a court order might be a red flag? Yes.
They don't respect the judge's orders.
Exactly. No boundaries. So if the person is telling you they don't want to have contact with you, that doesn't mean anything. If your mother is telling you not to have any contact, even if it's because that person's no good or whatever excuse your mom might give you to enable you to continue to engage in that behavior, I didn't say that, then that's not good enough. But if a judge tells you and you still aren't paying any attention, to us, that is very concerning, because there's no boundary there. There's nothing that person can, there's no authority that person recognizes other than what they want to do and when they want to do it. A change in lifestyle of the perpetrator. So let's say, for example, this is the person who was working, but now they've given up their job and they're just constantly trying to be involved in the life of the victim. Maybe they are going to the place where the victim works, basically changing their lifestyle to focus completely on the victim. Abuse of children or pets. Perhaps one of the saddest dangerousness factors that I see is one where children or pets begin to become abused because the abuse on the victim is no longer working. So the victim may say, I'm done, I'm not taking this anymore. But in order, again, we talked about how when that balance of power that feeling of balance of power is lost, the abuser will do things to try to get that back. And one of the things that will happen is they will escalate their violence onto the children and children and pets. Stalking, another very concerning thing. The old, if I can't have you. You all have heard this presentation before, haven't you? Okay. Yes, and a lot of times what we see is related to the other, one of the other lethality factors, the belief that the abuser will kill the person. One of the tragic things that we see in domestic-related homicides is that in 80% of those cases, the person who was killed has said to someone else that this person is going to kill me. And they really mean what they say. If I can't have you, then guess what? Nobody's going to. So a lot of people stay in those relationships because they believe that at least if I stay, then I know how he's feeling, whether or not I need to be on the defensive. I don't have to worry about him thinking that I'm with someone else, which isn't necessarily true. But a lot of people sometimes make that decision to stay with the abuser because in their mind it's actually safer. Strangulation, another very concerning factor. It's one thing for me to stand across the room and to shoot somebody and I take their life that way. But for me to walk up to someone, put my hands around their throat, watch them turn blue and decide whether or not they take their next breath, there is something very significant in the context of an intimate relationship, the message that sends. And what we're seeing is on a large number of our strangulation cases, homicides, pretty close to 50% of those cases, there was a recent incident of strangulation that was involved as well. Weapons or threat to use them, recent purchases of weapons, also an indicator. Previous domestic arrests or convictions, history with the same victim, escalation of battery or risk. This is the situation, for example, a lot of times we think of domestic violence as something that happens indoors or not a whole lot of witnesses. People generally don't want anybody to know about it. But this is the individual that will put the beat down on somebody in a Marsh parking lot in broad daylight. Why do you think that's so concerning? They don't care about the consequences, right? They could not care less who's paying attention to what it is that they're doing. And they also couldn't care less about the circumstance or whether or not they're going to go to jail, the consequences of their actions. The belief that the abuser will kill, that's what we've also talked about. And then accusations of infidelity, so you're cheating on me, and how close that actually comes to the violence. And that's the example that I gave you about you can't even say thank you to the cashier without somebody thinking that you're having an affair. Okay. So it's not, yes, sir.
Well, I was just wondering, with the availability of pornography, which is really all about control and humiliation, do you think that's a factor too in some of these?
In what way?
Well, young people have more access than I can imagine.
I think that there are a lot of things that happen in our society, whether it's music, whether it's television shows, that really have lowered the standards, if you will, of people that make them, I don't want to say it causes violence, but maybe the sensitivity is not as strong as it perhaps used to be. But that certainly could be one of those things. But again, I don't want to leave with the impression that these things cause, because violence is always a choice. So what we see, again, is that intimate partner violence, it's a very controlling, deliberate process. So the next time you see something about a tragic domestic-related homicide in the news, and this person snapped, they just went crazy, recognize that's not at all what's going on in these cases. It is something that happens sometimes over the course of years, that starts maybe with the verbal abuse and then gets to a point where the person feels the ultimate way to have power and control over someone is by ultimately taking their life. Go ahead. Yes.
Have you got any data on what percentage of verbal abuse ends up in physical abuse?
I don't know that there's any data on that, but it's seen as part of a continuum. So when you look at people who are in violent relationships, that's oftentimes how they start. And what happens is that's a part of the conditioning to allow somebody to get to a place where the physical abuse is a little bit more acceptable. Because I think we all recognize that if the first time maybe you went out on a date with someone, they hit you in the face, you'd be like, whoa, I'm out of here. Because that to us would be a red flag, right? But if it's these subtle little things that start with verbal and emotional that sort of break down your self-esteem, then when you are hit, your reaction is different than it would be had that completely come from out of the blue.
Is there any numbers on whether this abuse is trending upwards or if it's staying flat or
That's an interesting question that a lot of people are asking. I can't say that we are seeing evidence that the numbers are going up. I think that now it's getting a lot more attention than it used to be. It's a lot less tolerated and accepted in our society than it used to be. Used to be police would come out and say, if I've got to come back here, you both are going to jail. But now there is a lot more education. Much of it's done by our office with law enforcement and with other agencies to really let them know you've got to figure out who the predominant aggressor is in this situation, because if you don't, then the potential ramification isn't just those two people. It's the children that are involved, it's people in the community that are involved, and as we're getting ready to talk about in a minute, domestic violence can bring in a whole host of individuals that if our community does not have a correct response to, can be very deadly. So the short answer to your question is I don't know, but the knowing what we do about domestic violence, it's not that it's becoming more common, it's that we're just learning more about it and people are getting more to a place where they're able to talk about it and get more positive results in our community and law enforcement.
I wanted to go back to kind of Linda's last point about the notion that domestic violence homicides happen when a person just snaps. So they've somehow been provoked in an awful way. A case that I prosecuted back in about 2003 involved a man who beat his wife's head in with a gun. It was a gun that he was not permitted to have because he was serving under a protective order at the time. But he came into their home, which he had been prohibited from living in at the time, pursuant to that order and a pending divorce decree, and he beat her head in. And his story is, well, I knew she was in there with another man. And, well, she filed for divorce at the time, so the other man's story. Oh, and by the way, at the time, he'd gotten another woman pregnant. So how dare you accuse her of infidelity and say, that's the reason I had to come in there and take care of this. You made me do this. No. There's another woman who is pregnant already, okay? So the gig is up at this point in time. And yet we see this a lot, and it is a very common victim-blaming technique that gets hold of the public. And it makes them say things like, such a good man, if only she hadn't, blah, blah, blah. And so when Linda talks about numbers of domestic violence going up or down, is the situation better? And I think the system, in some ways, has gotten better at responding. In that we educate law enforcement officers, and we certainly have a group of prosecutors who are getting special training and whatnot to concentrate on these particular types of offenses. But I've said frequently that I think we've gotten better at victim blaming. And the question is, when you hear about these types of crimes in the media, is your response, what can I do to make this better? What can I do to stop the violence? Or is it, if only she hadn't done this, then this situation wouldn't happen. Or if only the victim in this case had just whatever. As long as that mentality exists, the violence will continue to breed. And quite frankly, online, if you want to know what people really think about domestic violence, read the online comments to any news story, okay? And you'll see the gamut. You'll see people who are clearly educated, and they'll kind of crawl on those, the trolls, though, who have their own set of opinions about domestic violence. They're more than happy to share them. But that's the place where I think they're the most honest about their beliefs. And sometimes the things that people think about domestic violence are shocking. These myths and more. And the truth is that believing those myths and believing that it's her fault doesn't make you any safer. We think it does, right? If I can just blame her for what it is that happened, then I'm safe. Because I would never do something stupid like stay with the guy who hit me. I would never do something stupid like take a man back after he'd hurt me or my kids. I would never, right? So I'm safe from this. Not at all. So blaming victims doesn't make us safer. Yes, ma'am.
So do you guys have some kind of training put in place for the officers that are in your county? Because this is what I see with the officers. They kind of believe those sameness because I see them come to certain people's homes and they'll say, oh, this is the same home. I've heard women say, oh, well, you're not beat up today and you're always calling, so just call us if something happens. And one young lady, she said, the officer said to her, she said, so are you guys just going to wait till I'm dead? And the officer said to her, well, you keep coming back. So do they have a training in place for the officers so that they're a little more in tune with looking for certain signs also?
First of all, which county is that? Is that?
She's in Marion.
She's in Marion County?
The women I
Okay.
work with are Marion County.
Okay. Couple things. The first thing is that we have what are called IMPD advocates. There are people that call on every domestic violence case, and if not, they can go ahead and call dispatch and ask to speak with a domestic violence advocate because something like that probably needs to be reported. Okay, and then they can tell them how to get that through the system. The other thing is, absolutely, we have training. We do regular training with our law enforcement, and not just IMPD, but all of the townships as well in Marion County. We do both the in-person training, we also do e-trainings as well. So there's really no reason for any officers not to be educated in the areas of domestic violence. Our office has taken a very strong approach in making sure that the people who are out responding to these runs are responding appropriately because we recognize that may be the one chance, the one time that a victim or the first time that a victim or survivor reaches out to try to get some help from the criminal justice system. And if that response isn't a good one, not only is that person in danger, the children are in danger, and the next officer that responds to the next run is also in danger.
Do you think that they might become numb to it? Some of the officers that are repeatedly making the same one
Yeah.
and, the same woman or man, because it could be both ways calling, maybe they become.
The training that they have is that is part of it, not the numbness, but it takes an average of 7 or 8 times of someone reporting before they finally are able to get or try to even get out of that relationship. So you have good people and bad people at the jobs that they do. And maybe she got a good officer on a bad day, or maybe she got a bad officer on any day. But I can tell you that there is training, and the overwhelming majority of our law enforcement officers are very responsive to the training. And we have seen, since our office began doing the training, we have really seen an increase in the improvement and the quality of the report writing and response by our law enforcement officers. I think we're finally realizing it as a community that it's not just prosecutors that can do it, it's not just advocates, it's not just police, but we have to have a coordinated response to really be able to deal with this issue. And we're also recognizing that coordinated response isn't just us, it's every one of you as well.
It's really important to remember that it's not just a victim who can make a report of domestic violence. We've had people come up to us on the breaks and say, I know A. And the issue is when that happens, when you see it, are you willing to pick up the phone and make the call? You have the concept right now, what is it, the kind of the blue movement, right? I pledge, the blue pledge, there we go. I promise to report crime, and that's important, right? I need you to pick up the phone, and I need you to make a report, because there are many times the victim cannot get to a phone, all right? So I need you to make that report, or the person is too small or too silenced to make a report. But then I need you to come to court, and I need you to testify. Make the report all day long, okay? That's great, because the person gets arrested, and then what do you think happens after that? Why do you think the officer gets desensitized to it?
Because they get out, but on that note, I actually had a woman that came to my house Saturday night who literally, I called 911, she had big goose eggs on her head. Mm-hmm. And when I told them, she came to my house, this guy beat her up, the kid got hit, they were both in my house. They told me that if she wanted to report him, because she was belligerent, she was just mad that I had called them but she was very battered. But the officers told me I couldn't make the report, that if she wanted to talk, have her call them, but it was nothing that I could say about it.
Yeah, sometimes officers will say, well, we need the victim. My experience in Crime Watch is not with domestic violence, but we need the victim to do the reporting.
Well, they do need to know that a crime has happened. So someone could appear at your doorstep with big marks all over them, and so what would the officer be investigating if there's no one saying, this is the person who did it to me or whatever? But where you do see it, where you do hear it, pick up the phone and make the call. And maybe just the officer coming out and you being willing to be there for the victim in that particular circumstance or the person needing help will be the encouragement that they need, especially if they see you saying, oh, I'll give you my name. I'll give you my number, officer. I'm not afraid. Ma'am, I will come to court and I will be there and I will tell the truth about what it is I've seen. Because, when Linda talks about, the faith community sometimes showing up for defendants, I got any number of people who will come to court and say, I saw nothing ever happened. But when it comes time to say, no, I saw him strangle her. I saw him put his hands around her neck in a car right out in the middle of daylight. That's a lot harder to get that cooperation. And I am astounded when I do see a person come into court and say, yep, I saw it and I'm willing to tell the truth about it. And that's what we need to make it stop, and to make some of the fear stop is for a victim to realize that they don't stand alone. Yes, ma'am.
Are there witness rights in this situation?
Are there witness rights in the situation? I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
If a witness comes forward, are they protected?
Will they be protected? What we don't have witness protection, like we're not going to fly you to a tropical island and put you up there, but certainly if the witness has concerns for their safety, we have ways to work with the witnesses to address those, and we do actually have specific funding and relationships with people to try to get those safety needs addressed. I can tell you, though, in my years of prosecution, it has been very, very rare that I've ever seen retaliation. Because, see, the batterer, remember when Linda talked about, these guys aren't crazy. They're not going out beating up their boss, beating up the neighbors. No. It's focused on one person. And so, exactly. So once you can help to get them out of that and you show a victim that I'm willing to stand with you, that might be what it takes to put an end to it. Yes, ma'am.
So let me make sure I have this right, because I've done this before. If I see an altercation in a parking lot between a man and a woman, and I doesn't look good, I call 911, I pull over and make sure the police show up. Once the police show up, I feel like I've done my citizen duty, but you're telling me I really haven't because I need to be a witness.
Well, yes, you've done your citizen duty part, right? Because you stopped the intervening, right? But how is this ever?
I wait till the police show up to do their job, and then I figure I've done mine, so then I drive off. But you're saying...
Oh, no, we haven't even begun. But I appreciate you calling, but I need you to stick around. I need you to be a witness, because here's the deal. Again, that fear and the lack of participation that we have from victims, they're terrified of coming to court and testifying against someone that they love. You saw it, though. You don't love him. So, right? No skin off your nose. So come to court, raise your hand, tell the truth about what it is you saw. That stops it. And it sends a message to judges that other people are seeing this and watching it and have an expectation that this isn't okay in the community. Because when it's just family members in there and everyone's like, well, I really just want him out. Why are we surprised when it's 7, 8, 9 times before something happens? Okay, no, you show up. You're a concerned citizen. I don't want this happening in a parking lot in my neighborhood, Judge. I don't want this person let out. I don't want this person back around. You send that message and we'll change
Even
the way.
If I say that and the victim is saying something else, it doesn't still
Well,
show up.
Show up.
Okay.
Tell the truth, and we'll let the system take care of it from there. Yes, ma'am.
Can I piggyback off that question by adding, what if the abuser is a law enforcement officer? Are there specific safety thresholds for the witness? I love our men and women in blue. I am not cop fashion at all.
Not at all. Not at all.
Trust me.
Yes, it
I mean,
does.
you know.
Yes, yes.
But, you look.
Right. The question is, what happens when the abuser is a law enforcement officer? Are there protections for witnesses? And again, that is something that our office can work with. There are special divisions kind of within the police department that exists to investigate those cases to make sure that it's not, hey, it's my beat partner who just got sent out magically on this run and, oh, wow, nothing really happened there. No, I mean, the department is working to take this very seriously, and they should be commended for that. So if you see this happening, please don't be afraid, to not just to get in contact. If getting in contact with law enforcement is concerning to you, then there's certainly divisions within IMPD, specifically the Special Investigations Unit, or a call to our office. There's ways to let other people know what's going on rather than just the person's beat partner. I know we're about out of time. What other questions, though, if there's any more?
I was wondering if you could flip back to the last page or two.
We are happy to get the presentation to you. I think our agreement was that we would get that to Annie, and then anyone who wants it can have it emailed to them. We'll just take the pretty pictures out of it, but we'll get it to you.
And Mr. Curry, did you have something? I thought I saw your hand up a little bit earlier. No?
Just wanted refills on coffee.
Okay. Oh, I thought you wanted to weigh in on something. No, okay. All right. Okay. Yes.
Are there any numbers that have been documented as this relates to a racial? It's not.
No, the question was, are there any documents as it relates to a racial group? And no, people who look like both of us engaged in or are victims of domestic violence. And all other ethnicities. I've trained on tribal lands as well. It happens there. I've trained in Utah, Mormon community. So when you talk about does alcohol cause domestic violence, I work with people who don't drink at all, and there's still violence. I work with people who drink a crazy, crazy amount, and there is no domestic violence with certain people. So that's not a factor. Yes.
Best case scenario, you get the witness cooperation, and you get a conviction. What are the sentences for these types of this type of violence towards women, men?
Yeah, excellent question. Is what is the sentencing ranges for different kinds of crimes? And it depends on what the level of offense is. I mean, you may be looking at an attempted murder case, you may be looking at aggravated battery, but the truth is that your basic misdemeanor level domestic violence, it's a misdemeanor. Maximum penalty is a year. It doesn't mean that there aren't things, though, that we can do within that year, and it's important to remember that sometimes some kind of maybe threat of incarceration coupled with at least an attempt to get them into a batterer's intervention program. Not anger management, but a batterer's intervention program. Really important distinction. That may be what we need, because for sometimes, again, for a victim, I don't want him to go to jail. I don't want to lose all this. But will you agree that he needs counseling? Oh, yeah, okay. So if we can get them steered that way the first time, okay. But as there are repeat incidents of domestic violence where there are convictions, those penalties do increase.
Get out of jail and commit the same act again?
How often do we see them get out of jail and commit the same act again? Yeah, we are employed and well employed, and will be employed for a long time doing domestic violence. Yeah, and quite frankly, a lot of it depends on what they think of the system and how strongly the system responds. A system that is responsive and that they believe that when I go before this judge or this court that I'll be held responsible and won't be allowed to get away with stuff. So a lot of it depends on factors like that, or just their own belief system about whether the system works.
And the only reason I ask that is because, if the system doesn't come down on these people as victims, what incentive do they have to speak up? It could be worse the next time.
It could be. Without intervention from people in the community to maybe be that safety net, absolutely. Sometimes the system may not be the only answer. Sometimes it's people like you saying, I'm willing to come here, I'm willing to learn, and get some answers. With that, I know we are getting the strong wrap-up signal. So do you guys want to allow for continued questions, or what do you? Okay. Who's that?
You've given probably about a half a dozen examples of where the abuser goes back in and actually kills the whatever their relationship with. How safe, after, there's been 7 threats that they're going to kill them, and then is there a national average? Is it 0.3% of the abusers go back and kill? Or is it 2.7%? Is there a national average that someone has compiled?
Not, if those statistics are out there, I'm not aware of how often. There are statistics that say that the first 3 months after a survivor leaves a violent relationship are the most dangerous time, and that if a homicide is going to happen, it's the majority of the time it's within that first 3-month span. But as far as how often they actually go back and kill, I'm not aware of statistics like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, when you think about all the domestic violence cases that we do see in Indianapolis, and yet the relatively low number of domestic homicides that we have, I mean, that's a credit to a lot of the work that Linda and the other officers have done. But we don't want to send a message to victims out there who may be considering a safety plan to try to get out that, boy, your death is inevitable. That is not the point at all.
Right.
And many men and women do survive ending a relationship, provided that they do it in a safe and healthy and planned way.
There's a neighborhood organization. I just was wondering, are there places that we can recommend to people that they go to if they are victims of abuse, like Colburn Place?
Yeah. Probably the easiest thing to do is call Connect to Help. It's 211. It can be called from, as far as I know, any phone. Mm-hmm. And they will be able to give information about shelters, where there's bed space, where they could get counseling. The Legacy House is an excellent agency that offers free counseling to victims of violence, domestic violence also. So
and child victims too.
Yes, and the counseling is free.
Free.
So we love Legacy House. So I would definitely say call 211, and that way, whatever that person's needs are, the person on the other end of the line is qualified and can address what their needs are. Yes. Yes.
I just wondered how effective is matter intervention?
That's a very good question. We as a community have been looking at this issue for several years now, because it used to be that when I started, we had anger control counseling that we were referring batterers to. And what we found, or what the studies have found, is that anger control counseling makes abusers more controlling. So it makes them more effective at doing, they're controlling their anger. So, but there have been, the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence has gotten together with batterer intervention programs, and they have come up with standards that batterer intervention programs need to have in order to be certified in the state. So they have been looking at these issues over the years, and in order to be certified, there are certain standards that need to be met, and one of them is recognizing that your main client is the survivor of domestic violence, not the person that you are actually that's coming to you to treat them. And there's a big collaboration between them and also advocates, so there's system checking to make sure that what they're doing is what they're supposed to be doing. So I would say that they are much more effective now than they were nearly 20 years ago. So, but again, a person has to really want to change in order for the changes to be effective. But batterer intervention programs are very effective in getting people to look at those issues and educate them in a way that causes them not to shift blame other places, but to own the actions and see what can be done to change them. Any other questions? Okay. Well, our contact information is, I chose the wrong color, didn't I? I'm sorry. It's Christina, Kristina .Korobov, KOROBOV @indy.gov. Or you can email me, which is Linda, LINDA.major @indy.gov, INDY.gov. I'll also give you my telephone number, because sometimes our email system filters out if it doesn't recognize a domain. So if you don't get a response from me within 24 hours, make sure that you can also give me a telephone call. It's 327-7979. Again, 327-7979.
And I'm 327-6944.
Either one of us will be happy to help you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here.
I slipped in again, and I have, I guess, a couple observations. Christine and Linda, maybe you correct me if you disagree, but I think there were a number of questions about numbers. And I think it's a little difficult to compare numbers or track numbers in that what conduct that used to occur behind closed doors for the most part is perhaps now more known because of increased public consciousness about the problem and more of a willingness of victims to come forward. And my other observation is this, and it's probably obvious after you've been with them an hour, is there are dozens and dozens and dozens of women in Marion County who are now safe because of the passion and commitment of Linda and Christina and the folks in our special victims unit. And the entire community owe a great deal of gratitude to these women and the deputy prosecutors and paralegals who serve in that unit.